Been a long time coming. Sidearm, Subby podcast. People have been very much requesting this. Let's just introduce ourselves. We're kind of like the low slot guys at Tread. Sean, Mark, Zombro. Give us an idea of your arm slot, and then when did you drop down? Have you always been from that arm slot? Was it natural?
So when I was in high school, I actually threw from more of like a 3/4 arm slot, and that was just coming from me yanking down with the glove side and a lot of head movement. So when I got to college my freshman fall, like I was still doing that, and velo was down like 82, 84. Eventually it just became like we needed to limit the head movement so I could be in the zone more. And then naturally it just started ticking down and having a lot more command, and then velo started ticking up as well.
So about sidearm or a little bit above sidearm?
A little bit above, like a tick above sidearm. All time, like that year, it started going to like 88, 90, and then progressively through my college career, I got up to 96. Strength numbers, front squat, I maxed out at 365, and then we only really dumbbell bench when we were playing, but I would run like 100s, 110s for 10.
So for you, the adjusting the head seemed to get everything else more in line and adjust the trunk posture as well. It wasn't an active attempt to drop the arm per se.
Correct.
It was adjusting the head.
It was more just adjusting the head movement so I could be in the zone and be more consistent. And then just naturally it kind of just started ticking down.
And so you throw harder from that lower slot than from a higher slot, which I think is important to note for some people.
Absolutely.
I used to be really over the top, especially when I did get the yips. I never actually experimented with like changing arm slots and stuff. I was more just domed up about things that really didn't matter. But when I ended up coming here then and starting to figure things out again, throwing more of a 3/4 slot, just like kind of like straight across or just above parallel, I ended up hitting 97. It was more of a happy accident a couple months ago to where I was throwing against somebody and I kind of got pissed. I was just sitting 95 and I didn't PR anything, and I was like, and I just went like this. And all of a sudden it was 92, and Zombro was like, you should probably work on that. And I was like, yeah, all right, I'll do that. And so since then I've been up to 95 from there, and command is way better. Just feel, personally, I just feel a little more connected throughout the entire delivery and just what I'm doing.
I mean, give us an idea of like some lifting metrics or physically where you're at.
So I personally love deadlifting. My deadlift PR is 675. Bench is not great just because of how much laxity I have in my body. So creating tension throughout lifting and stuff is kind of like hard for me to do. So I'm right around 225 on bench for a couple reps. All-time PR is 270, but that was a struggle. Squatting wise, I'm not like the biggest fan of it, but I'll usually working sets right around like 255 for like front squat.
And you're a little bit more on the hyperlaxity side?
Yes.
Just for context?
Yeah.
You're a little bit more on the tight mover?
Yeah.
Z is a little bit more on the tight mover. I'm kind of closer to you where I'm more on the lax side.
I've always been like a lower-ish 3/4. I think playing infield a lot in high school, that kind of determined my slot. I was actually a better infielder than pitcher in high school. I just can't run. I can hit, I can throw, but so from there I went to college. I would say I was more traditional 3/4. And then slowly I dropped maybe an inch or two just in pro ball. Obviously when I went to Tampa, they liked the east-west profile, and I figured out that my slider was good and how we could use that. So then of course I kind of ran with that. But for me, changing from organic here to like there was simply a postural adjustment for me. And so kind of similar to Sean in that regard of thinking about his head, for me it was just a little bit of forward posture and kind of playing into my strengths from the profile standpoint movement wise. So not a huge transition, always been lower-ish 3/4. Strength wise, I mean, obviously in college we all lifted pretty heavy, but squatting north of 400 pounds isn't an issue. Strength has never been an issue for myself. I would say I'm a strength driven guy, not great elastically. Like Mark the Shark is very elastic. So I know like in my own training that is a huge emphasis is elastic components of said details, especially how I can transfer energy on the mound. So being more elastic is a focus for myself, with the strength being something I've always been good at.
Yeah, and that's a good just like sidebar, is that once you've hit some of these like general strength numbers, it's not just about pushing those strength numbers higher and higher and higher and higher. At some point as a pitcher, you also need to work on the elasticity side, the reactivity side of the equation. So for me, my story is kind of similar to yours, where pretty much my entire life growing up, like I've always been a lower slot guy, but that slot has very much fluctuated. Like I'm sure all of our slots have fluctuated at times just naturally without even realizing it. So like I've been as low Like when my posture was really messed up, like in college, I've been as low as here. When I didn't even realize like I was that low, but I've been all the way down here, and then I've also been, you know, low 3/4, and then long tossing, like I've been a little bit higher, like during long tossing. But that always felt most natural to me. Like in long tossing, it'll be a little bit higher, and then as soon as I get to 60 feet, and I really try to keep my like head stable and actually like look where I'm releasing the ball, I just naturally feel a lot more comfortable in that more east-west rotational profile. So I never understood, like I would try to be over the top at times, and I would be like, okay, all right, let me try this one, and I would go and I would throw, and I would end up, and I don't know if you guys have the same experience, but I would still be there. Like I would specifically try to throw harder by getting tilt, and my arm still just wanted to be there. So I did actually play with like trying to raise my slot, and it just didn't really work all that well. And so I ultimately found that I throw the hardest when I'm right around sidearm or just above. When I drop just below sidearm, there's a huge drop off in velocity. So like I've never been over 90 miles an hour when I'm below sidearm, but I've been up to 98 when I'm here. So for me, there's something about just being able to get on top of the ball from here. Like I'm like a Max Scherzer type slot, whereas below here, suddenly it's a lot more difficult to get that leverage.
I think it's also very different depending on where you're coming from with the slot. Like you and I have talked about this some, and relative to guys who are late with the arm, etc. But for me personally, I have to think of myself as a north-south thrower, because if I don't think north-south, then my rotation doesn't funnel through like a clean window. I get huge counter rotation. I get really wide. I get late. And so with that, like you're talking about yourself, that small change making a big difference. Like I know in my mind, I have to think big time north-south.
So I'm exactly the same way, because it doesn't look that much different on video, but when I think in lanes and I actually think directional, Ferris wheel, in my mind I'm here, but again I'm still actually rotating from here. But the way that the ball actually comes out, I'm able to keep it more in a lane and not miss as much side to side.
Right.
But if I just like grip, rip, rotate, like that ball suddenly is like 22 inches of run that way, 5 inches of vert, and like I have no idea where it's going, and I'm just like, I'm going to be spraying balls arm side or yanking balls glove side. So the second I notice that I'm just like missing wildly side to side, I need to get back to that like directional lane focus. I don't know, Mark, if you have that same experience, because you're a lot lower than us.
Yes, so he's actually been great with me in bullpens, which is kind of attacking, like in more of like actually the execution part, to where if I get really like almost like long with the actual delivery itself, to where I just start casting very like early. And Z mentioned this a couple weeks ago with me, where it's like if you start so far in counter rotation, you're just going to be slow through the whole delivery, rather than you actually starting a little bit more neutral and then get into the counter rotation, so you can have that slingshot effect down the mound. Very like similar to what you guys were talking about, with just like making sure direction is still going towards the plate, even though we are rotating like a little bit more east and west.
Walk us through like what you were doing before and then where you're at now, because we've seen your kind of evolution from like mid 90s from here, dropping down, hitting 95, but then also I know you were like down to 88 at one point, and then you like figured it out and got back up. Talk us through like what was going on there.
So a lot of it just came down to just the initial load. I was just trying to force like myself into positions rather than just naturally flowing in and out of them. So biggest thing with me is making sure I still feel grounded through the whole thing. So since I have so much laxity, it's almost like removing slack in the delivery itself rather than just being floppy. So if I just come set like very tall, I just don't feel anything here. So something Sean and I have been doing is almost like a squat, to where it's like when I come set, I'm actually feeling myself already engaged, like lower half wise. So now with here, I'm already far enough away from the mound. When I pick it up, I'm already starting to move. And then from here, I just drop straight down, and I don't even think about where I need to be. I'm just then rotating naturally through the catcher.
And what about with your upper half with your arm? Are you still trying to, even as you're feeling tension from your lower half, are you still just letting your arm be completely loose?
Yeah, I don't think anything with my arm
really
action.
It's presetting a little bit of tension feeling in the actual hinge in the back hip.
Yes, if you want to call it like a hinge wise, yeah. I'm just more thinking just stay strong throughout the entire delivery and just rotate as hard as I can.
Do you guys have that same experience where you need to preset tension, because you're both more on that like tighter mover end of the spectrum?
I kind of would preset, so I'd preset a little bit of counter rotation and come like closed here, but when I picked up, it was a little bit of a coil, and then from there, It was just, honestly, I was trying to counter rotate because I am a tight mover. So like I tried to force a little bit there and go like glove towards first base because I knew I could close the gap. So like that wasn't an issue for me. I was just more like get a little bit more range there and then close the gap that way. And as far as like keeping me in line, it was when I'd finish, I'd actually try and finish almost like this way. So that directionally I was rotating through the target instead of when I wouldn't think that and actually like fly around, I would just come off this way and I didn't know if it was gonna go arm side or yank down.
Do any of you guys have the experience of like finding yourself striding cross body? Because I know that's also a common, I'm not gonna say issue, but it can, you see it a lot with low slot guys.
Well, you know I have no hip IR, and I'm clear of the lead leg, so
you
never me going.
But it is common to see low slot guys as the posture dumps forward, they get more into the toe, they start to end up leaking cross body. Yeah. And then again, you mentioned IR. If you don't have the hip IR to actually get around that lead hip, you get stuck. That knee's going to bow out, and you're not going to be able to actually transfer any of the energy up the chain. So, have you dealt with that at all?
Yeah, I actually personally think that the extreme crossbodiness is coming from you just dumping early. So, big thing that I emphasize with my submarine sidearm guys is making sure we're still rotating underneath the body, because it's like when you come up into your leg lift, throwing is throwing at the end of the day, and it's like when you push this out so far that you're trying to then land here, your pelvis is in a position to rotate, so you're just then slamming kind of like into this and getting stuck and everything's clearing together. So biggest thing with this is just like create the posture from your spine and your torso rather than trying to think dumping the pelvis or pushing this out of the way, so then direction and actually the plane of rotation for your pelvis is then messed up. So it's like, for me, it's like I'm going to land a little cross body, but this is the same way I would land throwing over the top. So it's not even more cross body, it just land how you normally would, so you still block the same way.
Can you explain it a little bit more and demo like the right and wrong way there? Like, are you talking about when you just kind of like dump into flexion here versus when you actually feel like a strong stacked position?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's like you'll see guys like, I know Justin Lawrence, like he's more like kind of like straight across shoulder plane, and it's like very deceiving because he does drop down pretty far and then he pulls out of it. But biggest thing is making sure the torso is still stacked over the pelvis, so it doesn't matter. It's like if you're starting here or if you're starting here, the last thing I don't want is just like you thinking it's almost like an RDL, to where it's like you're just then putting the pelvis in such an anterior tilt that you're not going to be able to rotate out of that position. Because you still want to have a disassociation.
You're looking more at the actual orientation of the pelvis and making certain, instead of getting that super arch position right here,
correct,
the pelvis is actually underneath you and you're maintaining that stack.
Yes, and that's the other thing too that I know Sean and I both work on a lot with our guys, just making sure the pelvis gets tucked underneath them. And I know that stems from even the drill that I prescribe to a lot of people of just like the Fisher Cat leg lift drill, to where it's like you're trying to still achieve the same check marks and somebody that would throw 100 miles an hour from up here. You're just, the only thing that changes is the torso angle itself.
Which I would argue that proper lifting, a proper RDL would teach you to keep the pelvis under this, like an improper RDL where you just arch. But if you actually squat, deadlift, like if you do those things properly and you are maintaining proper core positioning, like that will be reinforcing that in everything you're doing in the weight room too.
Correct.
But it could also be doing the opposite.
The other thing is, I guess, feel versus reality is the other concept that athletes don't know. Because it's like, athletes are really like, oh, what am I supposed to feel? Well, I don't know, because I'm never going to understand what you feel in the delivery. It's more trying to understand concepts and prove how they're trying to move, even in just general like gait cycling is like going to drastically improve how they, this is their proprioception and awareness of where they are in space when they're throwing.
For guys who are playing with this idea of dropping down, what are some of the common mistakes that we would want, like, ask them to avoid? Like, I know for me, a lot of guys have this misconception that like arm slide is just like this, like, okay, I'm just gonna do everything the same, but like just drop my arm. Obviously, like we know that's not exactly how it should be, but like talk through the postural connection to arm slot. So if somebody's considering dropping down, like what's the right way, what's the wrong way to play with that?
I would say the biggest thing, and something that I know you're a good reference point on this front, is actually still maintaining some lateral tilt of the spine. Versus, I think a lot of people, when they say, oh, I'm going to throw sidearm, the initial thought is just like lower half engagement's kind of out of the window. It's kind of just like dead leg, back leg, go ahead, dump the front side, and then it's just spin rotation, right? Whereas I know you're really good in terms of as you go through your drift phase to then have that seesaw effect of some lateral tilt of the spine. Whereas guys, I think when they initially commit to sidearm, whether that's, you know, right on plane, parallel, lower, whatever it might be, they just essentially negate elements of the seesaw effect in any lateral tilt. It's just clear the front side and scoop from there.
Well, and just completely ignoring the lower half in a lot of cases, like, oh, I'm going to throw from a low slot, and now that becomes the entire focus is like where their slot is, as opposed to letting the slot take care of itself, and the focus is still on the lower half, and just setting whatever posture you need to set. So if you're normally a more upright posture guy, and that's leading to a higher slot, it's like you can adjust the slot just from adjusting, again, still maintaining that core positioning, but just adjusting the degree of hip flexion. So adjusting the posture from the hip, that's going to dictate where you actually rotate from when you unload. And then you don't even have to think about where your slot's going to be, because your slot is dictated from where your posture is at this point in the throw. It's not just like, I'm just going to forget about my lower half, just like step and like sling it.
Just especially in pro ball itself. And I talked to a lot of lower slot guys about obviously axis of rotation, stay in a tight window, tornado down a narrow hallway, kind of that phenomenon. Ultimately, at a high level of playing, if you're not throwing competitive pitches over the plate, you're done. So yes, you can be east-west, but if your competitive pitch percentage isn't good, then you're done for. And when you become flat, rotational, and don't funnel things north-south over the plate, you're in trouble. So I think to your point where you just start thinking about this posture over and over, that deviation of miss gets really wide east-west.
And also just really hard to produce decent velocity from there. If you're purely an upper half driven thrower, like it's just very hard to produce any sort of effective velocity from that slot. You're already working, it's already an uphill battle, like figuratively and literally. Like you're literally working up against gravity. You don't have leverage on your side to the same extent. And I think one of the things that I notice, at least in a lot of hard throwing, specifically submarine guys, this seems to be a commonality in almost every like 90+ mph guy, is they have to use range of motion to overcome some of the deficiencies. Like to be able to throw 95 from here, you're already working against like quote unquote efficient, like optimal mechanical efficiency. So you need to make use of just like being a really good athlete, having a lot of laxity, being able to use range of motion to your advantage. I noticed that in a couple of the guys that you've worked with where like they didn't have that arm flip up and you were able to get them that flip up. They were able to jump up 4, 5, 6 miles an hour. Could you talk through your thought process with that?
So I don't necessarily like trying to throw plyos from like lower slots. It's more of just like understanding just the throw in general, because it's like everyone growing up threw over the top. So I don't care. It's like if you're throwing like super, super high or even like 3/4, it's like understand like how to leverage the pec, like how to use the front arm and actually how to rotate through the throw. And then from there, it's like the only thing you're changing is just thinking, all right, we're just going to like laterally bend. Like, so it's not like super, super complicated. It's just like, just understand what the throw is and then just apply it there.
So when you have a guy they're landing like here, and the arm doesn't actually have room to get up and back in that flip up position, so where they can actually get that stretch. What's your first thought when you see a guy landing here, and how do you get him in that same position?
So it's more of like just being patient in the actual delivery itself, because a lot of times people just like immediately as soon as they pick up, they're just rushing down the mound, and I feel that comes from like them thinking the drift is this major movement. In reality, it's like we're just trying to get our moment, like center of mass, and just moving. So it's just like understanding, it's like I personally have like really long arms, so I feel really uncomfortable being short. So I just like to feel like I'm trying to open up as I'm going, and then I'm able to close the gap really, really fast with like normal, I guess, arm slot guy or like arm length at guys and even like shorter arm actions. Just understanding it's like the pelvis is the first thing that needs to deliver. So it's like if we can get this going, a lot of times this will flip up by itself, so I don't even have to adjust arm action issues. Because the last thing I want them to do is like think so much on their arm action, then it's actually messing up what matters, and it's throwing strikes.
We talk a lot about when it comes to arm actions, like capturing the momentum of the arm swing. This is something I've thought about too. Is like, again, regardless of if you're a high posture like a Blake Snell, like he still does a really good job like capturing that momentum and creating a really clean loop of energy, getting that deep flip up, leveraging the pec, like all the stuff we're talking about. But it seems to me there are guys that can get away with like a little bit of a stab or like a much more short, tense arm action when they're a higher slot. I don't know that I've seen that from a hard throwing. Maybe Joe Smith is the closest I can think to of a guy who doesn't have that, but like almost all the guys, they really leverage that. They capture the momentum. They're able to be loose, deep, and that momentum allows them to still get the arm up, because you're not going to be able to really just like brute force and lift your arm up against gravity. You almost need to use momentum to get it up there.
Yeah, being a Cleveland guy, I grew up watching Joe Smith all the time. He was actually one of my favorite relievers. But like even like watching him through like True Media and stuff, it's like he's still hitting all the correct check marks. And I believe he was up to 95 from a very similar release height like I am. And it's just like, I start very tall, he starts very down, but the thing is he's very compact and very strong in the delivery. I just have to use my elastic components.
And he timed it up very, very well. Awesome. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the data side, the arsenal side, constructing an arsenal. Obviously we can pretty much assume we're talking about east-west profile type guys. You're not going to have guys who have like 20 inches of carry from any of the slots we're talking about. But that being said, there is an approach angle consideration here. So you are going to have your Edwin Diaz types where they're low slot, but they're still throwing four seams up in the zone. How do we know if we should be trying to chase the vertical approach angle advantage that we have from the low release height, four seams up in the zone, or we should be chasing more sinker profile, which that also seems to naturally kind of go hand in hand from the lower slots, being able to create that sink?
So I would say the first thing you're always going to go off of is batted ball results and looking at whiff rates, right? I know Mark actually had this with one of his guys a few weeks ago. If you really just think about it in layman's terms, if my average launch angle against is, call it 40 degrees, and my whiff rate's 40%, and guys are swinging underneath, okay, well then that tells me that I probably need to go more north, right? Obviously, if I still am creating some plane, some tilt, obviously the raw movement on the sinker is really good, and I'm getting balls hit into the ground or whiffs over the top, that tells you where you need to go. But I always want to reference the batted ball results first to see how it's performing outcome-wise, and then shift back off of that. I think one mistake a lot of guys make is thinking that I'm throwing from, and you can cheat this, right? You can be late with the arm, you can be scoopy, you can seam shift from that 3 o'clock axis, you can get down to -6, -7 vert, but if it's relatively normal from your slot, it's not going to be as good, right? And so people think, okay, I'm throwing a 0 vert sinker, oh, that's a really good sinker. Maybe the angles aren't good on it. So you really need to consider all those factors when making the decision.
I think that's an important distinction, is the movement profile on a pitch relative to that arm slot. And that's something that a lot of coaches don't think about. They're like, oh, if it's 17 inches of vert, that's always good. Well, maybe that's actually not great if you're like up here, because it should be 21 inches. But if you're 0 inches of vert, that's always like an elite sinker. Well, it is from Clay Holmes' arm slot, because that's just very unusual. But 0 inches of vert from here is like, that's pretty typical. That's what you expect as far as what the hitter expects as far as the movement profile. Versus like, you might see like, okay, Edwin Diaz, his ball just like takes off. It's like a rise ball, but it's only 13 inches of vert, 13, 14 inches of vert. So like a coach in isolation might have a guy throwing from here, 13 inches of vert, and be like, oh, that's a dead zone fastball. But if the batted ball results, to your point, are exceptional, he's getting swings underneath it, it still has the vertical approach angle piece to it, it can still be a very effective profile. So It's not just about looking at the movement in isolation, it's movement relative to slot.
Exactly. And that's like our data team's done a great job with a new tool where we're looking at all variables stay consistent and we change essentially one thing at a time, right? Is release height, release side, whatever it might be. And to your point exactly, if, for instance, that's why I think for myself, thinking north-south is so important, because I like to throw my sinker. Like I like to create plane with the sinker and make sure it's a ground ball pitch. If I'm lazy, scoopy, lower slot, I know the angle doesn't perform as well. So for me, being dumpy posture, get below parallel, throw a -3 vert sinker is not as good as when I'm timed up perfectly here at 0 vert, let's call it, right? And so I think looking at the angle specific to that, again, relative to slot, and the difference is important. Just like with changeups, I just had this talk with Jason Foley, and so he's a guy who pronates a sinker, wants to throw the changeup, and in a vacuum, everybody's like, oh, the changeup's good, it's down to 2 to 3 vert. Well, it's not really different than the sinker, so it's not great, and it's just 7 miles an hour slower. So maybe what's the next thing we do? Is that add a 4-seam to play that angle up? But to your point, you really can't look at movement numbers by themselves.
Right. What you want in a changeup is you want actual differentiation from the fastball profile. You want some actual drop, some additional arm slide. Like you want a different look versus it being the exact same look, just slightly slower. So if you're already getting that crazy sink on your sinker, throwing a changeup that's the exact same profile might not be as good as if you had the four seam with the changeup working off of it.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing is to look at the biomechanical compensations that are going to happen with guys when you force certain pitches on them in an east-west profile. I know I was just speaking to you about this, but I have seen nearly a dozen cases this offseason of guys who have wanted to tap into more supination bias, get big east-west, throw seam shift sinkers, throw a big sweeper, maybe a cutter, and with every single one of them, it's a ton of forward trunk flexion, a ton of counter rotation. Can we make the arm land a frame later? Well, we can do that because then in the unwind process, I'm better to tap into supination at that point. And every single one of them traditionally have been better from a higher-ish slot with the arm on time, and they've thrown a bit harder. So then you pick your poison. Do you want the guy throwing 97 from here, or you want him throwing, 60% efficient sinkers from here? And
right.
So I think you have to be careful on the data side and not be stuff blind to realize the biomechanical compensations that are going to happen.
Right. So you need to understand if the low slot is happening as a compensation and if it's actually negative relative to where their ideal posture and pattern should be. Like one of my guys was more of a three-quarter guy. He lefty, has some big league time, like people would know his name, but he got screwed up by one of the organizations he was with. They taught him a sweeper. They forced a sweeper on him. He'd never had that profile. He was a carry four-seam guy and a gyro slider guy from here. And suddenly his slot started to drop as he began to chase more and more sweep, trying to chase the 20-inch sweeper. Well, now his four-seam didn't have carry anymore. Now his four-seam wasn't 94, it was 90. Now they scrapped his gyro slider, which was his bread and butter pitch. His changeup got a little bit better metrically from the lower slot, but now he's bouncing back and forth between AAA and the big leagues, and he wasn't quite what he once was. So you have to be careful. Like if you're already committed, you're already submarine or sidearm guy. Like don't change that per se. But if you're a higher slot guy and you're just finding your slot starting to drop, that might be a compensation from chasing excessive movement on something like a sweeper.
Right. I think when you look at a guy, especially at the big league level, you look at their best bullet and you see where it came out, axis, efficiency, and obviously then what their spine orientation, plane of rotation was at. And then you work backwards off of that. Because I think you can certainly speak to this, when you organically get the guy to shift to sidearm related posture, in general, that should probably click. Like you shouldn't be thinking, I'm going to go from here to here and drop 6 miles an hour and consider it a win. So like for you, talk about how that was something where it was immediate, because you said it was command, velo, stuff. Everything.
So essentially, like I was forcing my way in the other direction. So I was forcing my way, like everyone threw over the top as a kid, and like that's just, kind of where I thought I was supposed to throw from. And then, getting into college ball where you need to perform or you're not playing, throwing it in the zone was obviously very important. So shifting the focus to keeping my head stable just naturally brought it down, and then, start working on lower half things. Initially, I didn't really see the velo jump right away because I was trying to force like a vertical shin and like getting stuck. Like he was talking about like getting stuck more way back here, and then I can't actually rotate. So it took a second to like actually see the velo jump. But things like just from the arm, upper half perspective, felt a ton better as it came down.
I think that's a good point, is that in my experience, like in my entire career, like anytime there's a major mechanical change that's likely going to work, it typically clicks pretty fast.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's like coaches I had growing up, in a lot of cases, like they would say something, I'd be like, that feels terrible. And they'd be like, oh, it's going to feel terrible for a while. You just got to get used to it. Like that was always, my experience was always when they said that, it never felt right. Like it was just like when something clicks, it clicks, you get it pretty quickly, and you're like, oh my God, why have I been not doing this my entire life? That feels so much more efficient. You can feel the efficiency of energy flow through your body. You can feel how the wave is actually like more powerful through your body. It's not like, oh, this feels like the worst thing ever. This feels awful. And then like 3 months later of just banging your head into a wall, suddenly it feels great.
It's the principle of how we all got there. It's like I was talking about I was playing shortstop, and this is just how I threw the ball, and it came out best. You said you were always kind of like that. You stabilized your head and got there, and you were pissed off and just slung a ball in there, and it came out good. You know, so I think when you get there in organic ways,
Yes. Versus forcing it.
that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, how many guys have we seen in, especially not to knock college baseball a ton, but how many, you know, it's the mid 80s righty and it's not going well, and it's like, all right, it's time, let's do it.
And they have no idea what they're doing, and they're just like trying to sling ball, like skip rocks from here.
Yeah.
So if somebody's gonna try to become a submarine guy, like how would you encourage them to get there organically? Would you just have them do some running pull downs where you encourage a little bit more forward posture and like just let whatever happens?
Well, honestly, you just kind of like brought up a good point. I think skipping rocks is kind of an unlock for it. I'm not joking.
I agree with that.
Like,
How do you use your lower? How do you make sure that you're actually using your lower half though, and you're not just like completely bypassing that? Because that was where you got screwed up, where you stopped remembering to actually use your lower half and load it, and you just kind of like would fall fall upper half.
Yes, but if we're just talking about how the upper half is going to work in the throw, like slinging rocks is like a great cue. Because I mean, I grew up on the water and stuff, so I would always be just like, doesn't matter where it was, I was just subconsciously just always skipping rocks, throwing rocks. And it was just like funny, when I did transition, it's literally the same thing that I'm doing. Now, obviously you're incorporating a lower half, but I'm not out like on the water trying to throw a rock 95 miles an hour, like skipping it, but it's the same principles behind it.
So would you suggest that be a way for them to work on it?
Yeah.
How do you incorporate the lower half though to where, because
It doesn't matter, you're skipping a rock.
I'm saying, like, how would you get somebody to? Would you be worried about them compensating?
In terms of what?
If this is like, I've been considering this for a while, my coach tells me I need to drop down. I want to do so in a way that is as organic as possible. How would you start? Okay, maybe that's like an arm action drill type thing. Is that
Yeah,
you?
let's back chain some drills.
How do you encourage? Because they're like, I don't even know like how high to lift my leg. I don't know like how far to come set. Where do you even start to give them an organic?
When you're playing catch play, it's almost like, just be quick with it and feel like you're an infielder. Just so you're not really trying to think about, oh, I need to be down here or I need to do this. Like, I'll do this with my athletes where it's like, even on light days, where it's like, make jump throws, make like, just like super, like, just like grounded underneath throws, to where it's like, I'm not thinking about where I need to be. And so this just becomes really just natural over time. And then from here, I'm not the biggest advocate of doing a ton of flat ground work in general, just because we don't have the same slope component. But I'm a big fan of shuffling down the mound in submarine. It's like, I've shuffled 97 from here. It's like, they're like, a lot of people are like, oh, TJ or whatever. It's just like, no, what's the difference of you throwing over the top? It's just like the same components are in play. So it's like, I just don't like throwing on a flat ground per se, because from there, it's like you're just going to be dumping this way more rather than you actually staying stacked and connected down the mound to where you're actually able to start rotating, and then the trunk then comes through.
And I think something you kind of alluded to there, you've like demonstrated everything like with your arm in plane.
Yeah.
And so I think people need to understand that like it's not inherently more injurious, like a higher risk of injury throwing from a low slot if your elbow is actually in plane. It's when you're not in plane, when your trunk is here and you're just like dropping your arm here and just completely dragging your arm out of plane. But if your arm is in plane, your arm is in plane with your trunk. So everything you've been demonstrating, the skipping rocks and how like you're demonstrating the torso rotating from that posture and the arm unwinding in plane, no different than a sidearm plane arm unwinding, more upright posture, and the arm unwinding in plane. But it's really our experience, like it's where the arm gets out of plane where you start running into potential injury concerns. When the elbow starts to climb up here, you run into issues, or when the arm starts to drag down here. Again, regardless of where your posture is, if the arm's way out of plane, that becomes a risk factor.
Yeah, I think I feel more logic-based to like work backwards through a problem like that. So for me, like arm action freestyle is a great way to start, to let the arm act independent of the trunk, kind of go where it wants. You'll see a ton of guys, you just tell them to jog forwards, jog backwards, and see where the arm goes relative to trunk. Some guys are very comfortable slinging it from wherever. And so when you do that, the arm's acting independent. And then if we put them into a lasso to feel trunk with arm, and then if you do a figure eight to then have momentum with arm trunk, and then obviously you can start to integrate the lower half, whether that's just progressing a rocker with a hover, etc. But I think if you back chain it that way, arm, trunk, lower half, you can, guys who really do gravitate towards it, pick up on that instant.
Yeah. And I guess the other option too, like I think those are all great ideas, but it could also be as simple as like keep your head level.
Yeah.
Like for you, it literally was that simple. You didn't have to think about it. It was just like, no, keep my eyes on the target instead of getting here.
Instead of like yanking
and
down.
Now that suddenly my posture automatically corrects because I've corrected my head, and everything just slots into place just from adjusting where your eyes, keeping level eyes and keeping a stable head position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like back to like the whole organic thing as well as like, and again to what you said about being an infielder, like take ground balls, be an athlete. Like we're not just, I know at times in my career, I felt a little robotic on the mound trying to hit certain checkpoints in the delivery, and like going back to taking ground balls, especially throwing from different arm angles, is like a good way to organically just like incorporate yourself into that.
I prescribe ground balls as one of the as one of the drills. Like in catch play, first 5 minutes, take ground ball, especially for guys who used to be infielders that threw hard like back in the day and they've lost velocity. It's like, well, how did your organic patterns emerge from the first place? They emerged because you played shortstop, third base, and had a cannon from there, and you could backhand fire, sequence everything perfectly. Okay, so I specifically for those guys, like the big leaguers that got drafted throwing 100, they were two-way players. Now they throw 94. Like those guys are 100% of the time getting some sort of ground balls. But even from like for other examples where maybe they weren't an infielder, it's still a very organic way. You're incorporating variability, incorporating problem solving through that process where you're not just like, I'm going to hit very static positions and force myself to get to a certain spot.
And you don't have to think about it at all.
Right.
Like you're just letting the body self-organize and being athletic.
It's funny, there was an old coordinator in Tampa, Marty Demerit, who's a legend. But we were talking about biomech stuff a couple years back, and we were talking about hand speed, right? And thinking, I know I talked to Mark some about this too, but I think kinesthetic proprioception awareness-wise, for me, when you're slinging from a low slot with hand speed, right? And how you're organizing things, you feel the ball so much better fingertip-wise when you're not thinking about, okay, like let me get the arm action deep, let me hit this position, then I need to pull here. When you're throwing low effort, if you're just loose, whippy, and feel from the hand component, I feel like your awareness goes a really long way, especially command training, etc. Like if I tell you to throw a ball and hit that dummy down there at 40 miles an hour, you're not going to be like, you know, slow mo to make it 40.
Right.
No, you're just going to flick with hand speed. And so I think that variability of feeling off the hand proprioception is big for funneling command work too.
Absolutely. That, and then I know you want to talk about the grenades versus darts.
Oh, yeah. So just like as far as command in general, like any slot, getting someone to actually commit to what they're trying to do and actually how they're supposed to execute the pitch, instead of like trying to nibble, like we're trying to force swing decisions. It doesn't need to be perfect, and you're human. It's probably not going to be perfect. You're not going to put it, you know, outside corner wherever you want to every single time. So think about it in the lens of you're throwing grenades and you're not throwing darts. So split the plate in half, and throw it at either side, but you're throwing a grenade, like you just need a swing decision. You don't need it to be on the black.
Basically, you have a larger error margin to work with because you're going to have that explosion concept versus like you have to be super precise.
Yeah, I think another kind of old adage thing that is not applicable here is talking about guys who are lower slot keeping throwing to a short distance. I actually think variable command stuff at further distances is more beneficial because, again, like I talked about, so we set the axis of rotation, right? And if we can agree that in general, your miss is going to be where your axis of rotation is. If you're here, you're going to miss this way. If you're here, you should miss more north-south, right? But we know that the over-the-plate percentage is so important. I have found that taking guys out 70, 80, 90 feet and having them try to do some element of command, again, not like located down away perfect at the knees, but squaring up a catcher in the chest, for instance, if my axis of rotation and the timing of acceleration is off by the slightest degree.
Off by 10 plus feet.
Exactly. Yep. And if you can just amplify that miss and then you funnel it in late, for low slot guys in particular, I've found that to be super helpful.
So I've always liked long toss for that reason, because not just for, let's talk about in a second, like for subby guys or sidearm guys, if that makes sense, but just for the sake of like, long toss can almost be looked at as command work in a certain sense, because if you spin off, you pull off, your timing isn't right and you're 300 feet away, like you're going to miss by 30 feet, you're going to miss by 40 feet. And so you actually have to be fairly precise in that fairly narrow lane to actually get the ball to your target from 300 feet, 200 feet, 250 feet away. And so it just exaggerates the misses arm side, it exaggerates the yanks, and it does force you to be in that lane. Now, is it exactly like command training? No, but if you can stay in that lane and get it to a partner 300 feet away, and then maintain that lane as you come back to 60 feet, you're going to be roughly over the plate.
Yeah. And I think there's also a neurological visual component of that, right? Is if you, like I'm sure for you, Mark, this was a big thing, externally focused visualization to help your command is, okay, all of a sudden I used to be, because you had like a cutty profile up top, right? Like cut carry-ish?
A little bit, yes.
Regardless, if like you're up here and you're playing a straight line, okay, well now my command focus is not straight line. It's like, oh, I'm starting it there and like I'm funneling into the zone. I think those visual components are really important for low slots.
Well, and too, like the catcher looks like he's 40 feet away if you just thrown, even if it's just 90 feet, and now you come back into 60 feet, like it looks, visually it looks a lot closer and you feel like you're on top of the plate. At least that was always my experience, versus if you just like hop up on the mound without doing that, like, at least for me, like the catcher will look 75 feet away sometimes, where I'm like, oh my God. And you know the day you're about to have, or the bullpen you're about to have, based on how close or far the catcher looks from you. What are your thoughts on long toss, on pull downs? Let's start with long toss for sidearm subby guys.
I think Mark made this point earlier about plyos and letting subby guys throw plyos normal. And for me, I feel like that is a huge thing that especially pro guys gravitate towards. Is if you're a high slot guy who's cheating for vert and we want to get you on plane to whatever axis that is, to have you throw plyos and feel like you're loose, whippy, low 3/4. I think moving opposite and having that variability of where they can slot in is a good thing. I think the variability training component is great no matter what. Obviously, we're going to get hyper specific when we get back into a certain distance, but I'm all in on having variable training of putting the arm in different slots and being adaptable.
So allowing them to throw from slightly higher slot, allowing them to work out some distance, whether it's 300 feet or whether it's 120, 150, 180, so that they can start to understand and be able to naturally self-organize a little bit better.
Right. I think doing drill work specifically on the way out in your long toss is heavily beneficial too, right? We talked about back chaining, arm action freestyle to a lasso, figure eight, and then incorporating things one by one. So if you're doing that as a low slot guy, I don't know, maybe you start with like 10 toes, you maybe go to a rocker variation, and then you're doing some lower half integration, but just keep stacking things as you go out. And if the posture and plane changes slightly as you have to throw the ball more uphill, so be it, as long as you're getting back downhill.
Right. And that was always my experience, is my slot would generally creep up a little bit, my posture would creep up a little bit as I worked out. Like I think the most I've ever done was like 380 feet from like a side step. And that was from a little bit higher slot to obviously create that type of axis, that type of backspin. But then on the way down, my slot would start to drop. And so it wasn't like just because you do some throws from a higher slot at some point in your throwing program, it's instantly going to screw everything else up. Like we've obviously all learned that like old school coaches in a lot of cases are very anti long toss, because like, oh my God, it's a different posture. It's not exactly the same mechanics. But that's not the point. Like Alan Jaeger will say, like, you actually want to come out of your mechanics and teach your body to throw from here, like all different slots, all different trunk postures, and that actually gives your body more dynamic variability in terms of what it's doing, more athleticism awareness. It's not like the robotic feeling that you're talking about, where like I only ever practice one thing, one static thing. It's like you're learning to be athletic. An infielder isn't just practicing throwing from one slot. They're able to throw from here, and that's part of what makes them so athletic. That's part of the athleticism equation.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree as far as like, I would creep up definitely in long toss, but like I'm all in on that. And then once you get back to a certain distance, for me it was about like 150, 120-ish. That was when I'd start more focusing on like, okay, let me get it back down and throw from my actual slot. But as far as like working back there and throwing it as far as you can, like, again, be an athlete. Like, we are not robots by any means. So learn to throw from different areas.
In terms of experience with myself, it's like I would get really, really pushy behind the ball and I'd absolutely just launch them. But when we'd come back down to compression throws, I wouldn't have naturally like kind of the same just arm action wise. So I personally like trying to keep like long toss to where like around 150 feet. So I can keep things generally on a line, and then being from extreme like underneath, if I'm thinking launch the ball, I'm gonna be pulling up and off of everything, and I just wanna be working through my target. So that's why I do like actually mound like shuffles rather than just straight like flat grounds, because I'm actually gonna be working down the mound and actually working through rather than thinking like on an actual flat ground here, I'm gonna have to try to work up. And then I think that also then goes into the arm action itself, to where when you're coming up, that's when you get a little scoopy, a little bit more underneath the ball, a little bit more drag on the arm as well.
It's probably important to note that your biggest like flaw, I guess, from this slot, if your mishap is being climby, pushy, then yeah,
Right.
long toss probably isn't great if you're feeding into that compensation that a guy really fights with.
Yes.
So I understand that point. And you're also pretty new to the slot, so you maintaining an excessive number of reps to feel that out makes sense. But I think if you're a guy, especially who's been doing it for a while, the variability is good.
For me, I always struggled to figure out how to throw a slider from a low slot. And like when you're talking about like the scooping phenomenon, I know exactly what you're talking about, because that's what I would feel. I would feel like I'm just getting underneath the ball, but if I could get here on top of it, suddenly I could actually create action. But when I felt like I was underneath the ball, I would just get this loopy, backed up, like spinning slider. I don't know if that's something you guys have felt, or if there's like similar struggles in terms of off-speed pitches and actually creating a secondary pitch off of that, whether it's a sinker or a four seam.
I personally have not. When I dropped, all of my stuff drastically improved. Just in terms of like breaking ball wise, it was very easy for me to understand, like almost like throwing a frisbee, to where I'm just like throwing through, like set my like target location and just rip it as hard as I can. I feel over the top. For me personally, it was just like very hard to think like, all right, change up, like I'm trying to pronate it. Like it just like, it's very natural for me down here just to think, just throw, just like set the grip, let everything do it when it needs to do.
This is coming from a heavy supination bias pitch.
I was gonna say, I don't have supination.
No, yeah.
So for me, I think it's harder to get to those positions. Like, but in my case, like I don't know that it was necessarily about the slot as much as the fact that I'm not a supinator. I don't have good supination. I've actually broken this wrist twice when I was a kid, so I think that's part of it. But anytime I would try to really get around a slider, like I would have to really cheat to get to that position and get underneath the ball. Whereas like later on, like more recently, learning like a spike grip, you don't have to have the same level of supination. You can kind of throw like a fastball or just like a little bit of cut and still be able to create that sweep without needing to throw like a traditional sweeper and like really get around it, or a slider where you're trying to just max supination.
I mean, for me, I threw a spike grip as well, but I mean, my thought process behind it was more slurvy than like just straight true sweep. So, I mean, my thought process behind it was like I'd get out and then almost like snap down to the hip. So it was honestly kind of like a curveball thought process that just kind of blended into sweeping more as I dropped down. So I didn't really experience too many issues with it. Honestly, at certain points in my career, like that was the pitch that I was most confident in landing for a strike. So that was just my thought process behind throwing the breaking pitch from there.
So I'm also curious about this because I work with Ben Heller, who's a low slot guy, and his bread and butter has always been, okay, sinker, sweeper. This year, he added a cutter. He had like a gyro slider or cutter thing to kind of bridge the gap. I know you talk a lot about like having something to bridge the gap, so you're not just throwing pitches that have 40 inches of separate. You're not just throwing the 20-inch sweeper and the 20-inch sinker, something to bridge the gap. For him, that was super important this year because he's sometimes struggled to locate the sweeper. Like if he's off just a hair with that release, like that ball's like in the opposite batter's box because it just moves so much that if his focal point's just a little bit off, if he doesn't start it like behind the righty to get it in the zone, like he's just yanking it way off. And so when we added the cutter, now he has something that he knows he can throw for strikes whenever. If he doesn't have feel for the sweeper on a given day, he can go to the cutter, gyro, and know he can get it in the zone. Obviously, that goes counter to what the trend is, which is like low slot guys throw max sweepers. But what are your thoughts on a cutter or like more of a gyro slider, even though it's going to be from a lower slot?
So I think, first off, from a biomech perspective and seeing supination for guys, I think the best thing you can do, we'll just stay low slot for now. I won't talk about the other deviations, but low slot would be how hard can you get to the zero line? And for Ben Heller throwing 98, maybe he can get to the zero line, regardless of vert, if it's more gyro-y or cutter-y, Maybe he does it at 93, right? Okay, well, that's great. That's essentially a fastball. We know that's going to perform better against lefties than what his sinker is. So from that standpoint, I know how hard he can get to the 0 line. And I really believe in pitching off the middle ground then enables your arsenal. I said I wasn't going to talk about other arm slots, but I am. So like with Brock, 3/4, lower-ish 3/4, cutty 4-seam, ended up throwing the cutter insanely hard this year. He throws the cutter, now he can go upright with 4-seam, he can go right with sinker, he can go down right with changeup, and he can go left with sweeper. The whole arsenal's opened up because he's pitching off the middle. But I also think from the biomech perspective, you can learn a lot about guys with how hard they get to the 0 line. So can he throw the sweeper comfortably? Can he then go back to the sinker? Just like where does he match up motor preference wise to maximize that? But I think the cutter is huge, and typically it's a really good strike pitch. Guys, if they have feel for some supination and getting off of the middle finger or pointer finger, whatever they kind of prefer there, they can do that religiously for strikes, which is really important in my view.
And that's how he used it, is more so like to lefties as like his fastball to lefties. But over the course of the year, it was kind of experimenting with, okay, he can throw it 92 and keep it more of like a cutter, like get to the 0 line and it's more of a cutter, but it's like 10-0. Or he can throw the more gyro slider one where it's more like 0-0, but it's 86. And that started to induce a lot more whiffs. So it's kind of like which do you choose? I guess that goes back to the 4-seam, 2-seam question, is like, you just look at the batted ball data and you figure out like, okay, I can make this pitch move a bunch of different ways. Obviously, this is a more difficult conversation for college or high school guys that don't have advanced analytics. But even just like looking at what the hitters are telling you, like if you're throwing the more cuttery one and it's getting hammered, and you're throwing like the one that has some depth to it, and that one's just inducing whiff after whiff after whiff, that still tells you something.
Regardless, I think command-wise, so Colin Snyder is a great example, and I wish like we could have him on this talk because he's a low slot guy. Started working with him in July, I believe, and he's a guy low efficiency sinker, like too low because the arm was late, super scoopy. But for him, when I first started working with him, he could not command sinker sweeper, and that was like his biggest thing. He's in season, he's got to throw strikes, he's up and down from the big leagues, and so I, again, know he's supination biased. The arm's a little late. Of course, we're going to work on arm timing, but I don't want to bog him down mentally in season. And so I'll never forget, I told him, I said, listen, if your efficiency is getting so low on the sinker and we're struggling to command it because he's trying to push it arm side, and then the sweeper, he's really trying to get it, so maybe he's yanking it. I'm like, just throw a cutter. Let's see what your cutter is. And this is a guy who's averaged, call it 95, 96 from here. I'll never forget, first night he throws in Omaha, AAA with Kansas City. He busts out a 95.4 mile an hour 2-2 ball. So like a 95 mile an hour gyro slider from this slot. But that was his preference at the time, just based on where the arm landed, supination bias. But that enabled him then to say, okay, well, if I have this cutter, I'm just throwing it right here. Like, I'm not trying to go arm side, I'm not trying to pull glove side. And that kind of funneled him in. And then obviously as the arm timing got better and better, the cutter got better. But I think it's a huge pitch that can tell you what's going on from the biomech side.
Right, and also just realizing, like from a lower slot, you naturally have a lot of deception on your side. Like a gyro, even if on paper a sweeper would perform better, if you can't throw it for strikes when it counts, like at least having something that has a little bit less movement that you can throw a little bit harder is still it still can be a very usable pitch. I'm thinking specifically of Josh Hader, who I've been able to work with for a couple of years, and you wouldn't know from looking at a slider that it's a gyro slider, because it looks like it's a sweeper, because of how cross-body he is and how far over he's releasing, like the horizontal approach angle. It looks like it's got so much movement, and then you look at the movement profile and it's like it's a gyro slider. But if he were to throw a sweeper, like it's going to look like it moves 4 feet.
Right.
So you're already getting that huge deception component just from releasing way off to the side. But his point was, like, you know, he wants a pitch he knows he can actually throw for strikes. He's going to be coming in high leverage situations. He can't afford to just like completely bounce a pitch in the opposite batter's box. So he wanted something that was a little bit harder, a little bit easier to command, and still has the deception component. Even though on paper, like, would a 20-inch sweeper play better against lefties on paper? Yes, but is it usable at this point? His thought was no.
So the angles, and talking about trying to really get to a breaking ball, etc. Look at at Seawald, you look at Penn Murphy, Grant Anderson. Those are guys who I'm thinking of who have really good performing breaking balls, but you go look at them on a movement plot, and if you were stuff blind, you would be like, oh, these aren't very good, right? But you watch them in a game and you're like, oh, wow, like, how does anybody get to that? So to your point, from here, you really can't be stuff blind. Well, you can't do it from any angle, but you really need to actually trust your eyes of how the angles are playing and that deception component of how pitches will play up. That's like when the sweeper first became prevalent and call it 2022, the vert was a positive thing, right? And so if you're throwing a sweeper from here, maybe somebody would say like, get more depth on that, etc. But the deceptive components are the whiffs are underneath, right? So positive vert's a good thing. So using those angles deception wise, like you want to be good and have good stuff, but you don't want to crush yourself to try to hit a certain metric.
I want to talk about customizing drills, because most of the guys watching this are probably like the one guy on their team that's like a subby guy, or the one or two guys that's a sidearm guy. A lot of times the coach doesn't know what to do with that guy. You're just kind of like off on your own. It's like, okay, guys, we're all going to do like this pivot, pick off, roll in, weighted ball thing. Oh, Johnny, like you do whatever you want. Like, I don't know what to do with you. Or like, we're all going to do long toss. I don't really know what to do with you. Like, they're kind of like left on their own. They're like, I don't know. Do I just like do what they're all doing? And like how do they customize drills to themselves, basically? Like, you have a pivot pickoff, for example. Like, should they do that? Would you do a pivot pickoff? If so, how would you customize or adjust that to your slot or posture? Or would you not even think about it and you would just throw it from wherever it happens to be, and then whatever happens on the mound happens on the mound?
Yeah, like going back to what we talked about earlier, when it comes down to just like moving, it's like I just want to move athletically, like throughout the drills itself. So it's like when I am playing catch and like just throwing, a lot of the stuff I'm doing is out of a roll-in, so it's like I don't have to worry about like other aspects of the throw, to where it's like I am just like clearing, blocking, and it's like as I'm coming down, then from here I'll just rotate into my normal slot. I'm not trying to like force a position or try to like really work on hammering like what this looks like. It's more of just let the body self-organize, and it's going to be in its prettiest like fashion. When we ultimately refilm the videos the next time, like for all the different drills we do, what I want to do is, okay, I will explain through the concepts and demo it, but like also get like 3 or 4 other demos and we stick those all in the same video. So it's like, no, you see that a pivot pickoff can look like this, and it can look like this, and it can look like this, and they start to see the bandwidth. A rolling can like look like this, but it can also, and so you see how guys with a whole range of body types can still execute a proper version of so-and-so drill, and so it's not just trying to imitate this one specific version of it.
Also on the mental side, so your question was regarding drill specifics, tailoring to slots, etc.
Yes.
So from the mental side of this too, Pete is great with this. So Fairbanks, being an alter ego guy himself, essentially it's, our first 3 drills, he thinks of himself as a thrower, right? Like, be athletic, let the arm go where it wants to go. And then there's a time and place for the specificity component of, okay, I don't counter rotate, I'm all lateral tilt driven, I need to get to my slot, get downhill, whatever. So I think there's a time and place, and you have to decide that and be conscious of, this is going to sound old school, am I training myself as a thrower or a pitcher for that specific point in time? But I think you have to differentiate that for yourself.
All right, last question. Do you think you have to be a little bit weird to be a low slot submarine guy?
I'm not weird.
Is that just a lefty thing?
No,
I wouldn't even say me.
Sean's fine. You're weird and Mark's weird.
I'm just out there.
Yeah. Can I just point out that Zombro's quarter zip has been slowly dropping over the course of this entire podcast?
I did it. Slowly but surely.
Let this eat.
Electric.
I did.
All right, I appreciate you guys. Hopefully you guys got value out of that. Drop comments down below if you have any further questions. We'll get to all those, but thanks again, guys. Appreciate
Awesome.
it.
Yep.
Yeah.